Hey there, let's jump right into this explainer and unpack a profoundly structural critique of society that diagnoses exactly why so many of us feel so constrained. Today we're going to explore a really fascinating concept derived directly from our source material called the triangular prison. It's an invisible architecture that has actually shaped human history for thousands of years, operating right under our noses. But this isn't just a history lesson. It is about the very real physical sensations of restriction you might feel in your own daily life. If you've ever felt like your most honest questions were somehow dangerous or off-limits, well, you are going to find this incredibly illuminating.
So, to start things off, I want you to think about a 5-year-old kid you know. Picture them fearlessly asking questions. You know the drill. Why is the sky blue? Why do we have to eat? Why are things the way they are? They're basically operating as a scientist, a philosopher, and an artist all rolled into one. Now ask yourself, what happens to all that relentless creative intelligence by the time we reach adulthood? Why do our questions get shorter? Why do we learn to selectively silence our own curiosity? Our source material argues that this loss is absolutely not just a natural part of growing up.
And we actually have the empirical data to back that up, thanks to George Land's research for NASA. Back in the 1960s, they administered a test specifically for divergent thinking to a group of children. The numbers are just staggering. A massive 98% of 5-year-olds scored at a level classified as creative genius. 98%. But by age 15, that number completely plummeted to just 12%. And in adulthood, a mere 2%. Land's conclusion was a real game changer. We aren't taught to be creative, we're actually taught not to be. That genius is fully present before any institution gets involved, but those very institutions directly contribute to shutting it down.
So the crucial takeaway here is that this drop in genius isn't just natural aging. It is a deliberate output of an invisible control system called the triangular prison. Our sources define this as an architecture built from 3 distinct walls: tradition, religion, and education. Now, standing alone, these are incredible gifts, right? Tradition gives us memory, religion offers meaning, and education provides power. But when they are captured by institutions that are terrified of being questioned, they fuse together into a cage. The core feature that makes it a prison isn't the institutions themselves. It's a strict, highly emotional prohibition on ever honestly examining them.
Think of it like a room closing in on you from 3 sides, compressing your native intelligence. First, tradition attacks your genius of origin. It demands belonging so fiercely that simply asking, "Hey, why do we do things this way?" feels like a betrayal to your community. Then, religion attacks your genius of ultimacy. It demands meaning in a way that makes any honest doubt feel like a terrible spiritual failure or even a sin. And finally, education attacks your genius of method. It demands capability and strict compliance, so exploring unexpected, out-of-the-box answers just feels like an academic failure. There's basically no direction a questioning mind can move without smacking right into a wall.
Now you might be thinking this is just some modern glitch in the system. Nope. The source illustrates how this architecture has been building and perfecting itself across 5,000 years of human history. If it were just a product of the Industrial Revolution, it might be an easy fix. But this traces all the way back to the Sumerian temples of 3500 BCE, runs straight through ancient Egypt, solidifies during the Roman Empire, and gets highly formalized in 18th century Prussia. This system has been iterated on for millennia.
Let's actually zoom in on that Sumerian template for a second. In ancient Mesopotamia, the temples were not just places of worship, they were the entire administrative and economic hub. The priest who served the gods was the exact same guy who controlled the grain supply and recorded your debts. They deliberately fused your spiritual and financial obligations. Because of that, questioning an economic debt felt exactly like religious impiety. And get this, the source notes that the world's very first writing wasn't beautiful poetry or deep philosophy. It was literally inventory lists and debt records created to serve this exact prison.
Fast forward to ancient Egypt, and we're looking at a deeply fascinating experiment in perfect captivity that lasted for an astounding 3,000 years. For 3 millennia, ancient Egypt used this overarching concept of ma'at, which meant truth, justice, and cosmic order, to enforce total cultural stasis. The absolute brilliance of this system was that producing something new wasn't just seen as socially rude, it was considered cosmologically catastrophic. So you had 3,000 years where the genius of every single new generation was successfully processed and used entirely to maintain the existing institutional order.
Then we hit the 18th century, and the educational wall gets a massive upgrade courtesy of Frederick the Great in Prussia. As the source clearly states, this new educational system was designed purely for compliance, absolutely not for genuine learning. And we still see its DNA everywhere today, right? Fixed time periods, standardized testing, and rewarding students for just repeating received information rather than generating original thought. It was later exported all over the globe through colonialism to produce people who would basically administer their own subjugation. The goal was never to teach people how to think. It was to teach them what to think. So how on earth do you police all of this without literal guards standing over everyone? Well, you install an internal psychological guard. You do this by converting external rules into deep physical shame. The source makes a really vital distinction here. Guilt says, what I did was wrong, which is great because you can fix that by changing your behavior. But shame? Shame says, I am wrong. When a kid asks a prohibited question and gets a socially chilling response, they don't just learn that the question was bad, they learn that they are bad for even thinking to ask it. The genius gets entirely walled off behind the child's own nervous system.
And here is where it gets really wild. Because of that internalized guard, we actually end up protecting our own cage. Leon Festinger's famous study on cognitive dissonance shows us exactly how the human mind reacts to threats against this prison. We don't naturally update our beliefs when presented with new facts. Instead, we desperately defend the prison walls. You've probably seen the signs: aggressively attacking contradictory evidence, feeling personally attacked when an idea is questioned, and completely refusing to update foundational assumptions. Our intelligence, when paired with that defensiveness, just becomes a much more sophisticated tool to keep the cage locked.
Okay, moving on to our next section, the sorting machine, and exactly how the prison assigns different cells.
Because you see, not all inmates get assigned the exact same cell. The prison functions as a massive sorting machine. Historically, it's used things like scientific racism, caste systems, and patriarchy to systematically shrink the cells of women, colonized peoples, and minorities. A perfect example of how this sorting is maintained is through the capture of genuine cultural values. Take the beautiful African philosophy of Ubuntu. I am because we are. In its genuine form, it is all about mutual flourishing. But when that concept is captured by institutional power, it gets weaponized to enforce hierarchy and silence dissent. The community is suddenly told that standing apart or asking questions is a threat to the collective. It's a clever manipulation that turns the inmates into their own dedicated guards.
Okay, let's talk money, because this entire system is completely self-financing. A major historical example highlighted by this source is the medieval Catholic Church, which at one point owned roughly 1/3 of all agricultural land in Western Europe. Through things like tithes, the sale of indulgences, and holding a strict monopoly on access to the divine, the institution created an absolute economic masterwork. The spiritual and the economic were fused once again. The prisoners were essentially funding their own captivity, genuinely believing they were paying for their spiritual survival. And looking objectively at a modern iteration of this dynamic, the source analysis points straight to the prosperity gospel. It's an incredibly profitable business model operating globally right now. What it does is take a very natural structural question like, why am I poor, and completely redirects it inward. It frames poverty as a personal spiritual failure, or just a lack of faith. It effectively convinces some of the most economically desperate populations in the world to fund their own confinement. They give their limited resources to the institution, hoping for a breakthrough that the theology promises, but the very structure of the system prevents.
So what actually happens when someone threatens this perfectly tuned machine? Well, anyone who bypasses the institution or threatens its total monopoly on truth is systematically silenced or eliminated. Joan of Arc wasn't burned at the stake for being great at military strategy. She was burned because she claimed direct, unmediated access to God. She bypassed the church entirely. Galileo? He wasn't silenced just for being good at math. He was silenced because his astronomical observations fundamentally threatened an institution that had based its absolute authority on a completely different model of the cosmos. The prison protects its authority at all costs.
But, and this is a huge but, survival and resistance are totally possible. The source highlights Nelson Mandela as a profound example. He proved that you can survive the prison, study it from the inside out, and actually use its own tools to dismantle its logic. Even though he was educated within the colonial system and physically imprisoned for 27 years, Mandela absolutely refused to let that physical cell become a psychological one. He took the very legal and linguistic tools the system provided and used them to expose and dismantle the entire architecture of apartheid. It is an incredible case study in reclaiming your own mind.
So, the underlying conflict of this entire framework really boils down to two ways of thinking. Institutions desperately need your convergent thinking. That's the ability to work within strictly defined rules to find the one single correct answer. They need that to maintain the system. But they are absolutely terrified of your divergent thinking, the outward, rule-breaking, messy generation of totally new possibilities. Convergent thinking makes you a highly useful employee and a compliant citizen. Divergent thinking? Well, that makes you a philosopher, an inventor, and a massive structural threat. The big question then is, how do we reclaim that divergent thinking? The source lays it out in 3 distinct steps. First, the initial act of genuine freedom isn't just mindless rebellion, because rebellion is often just an equal and opposite reaction to the cage itself. The real first step is a sustained, deeply honest examination of the beliefs that actually govern your life. Step 2 is learning to sit with the profound emotional discomfort of all that uncertainty, without immediately running back to the safety of the institution. And step 3 is the slow, deliberate recovery of your native divergent intelligence. It's about clearing away the ash from the genius you were literally born with.
Which brings us to a final, really provocative thought from the text to leave you with today. Who taught you to call the cage a home? This triangular prison of tradition, religion, and education really only holds us because we've internalized the guards. But that 98% genius you had at 5 years old, it is still in there, just waiting to be recovered. All you have to do is turn the handle, because the truth is, the door was never locked from the outside. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep asking those fearless questions, and I will see you next time.